Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com with a video about single page applications and sort of like, what are they and why do they matter? So this is like a high level video, not about any actual, we're not gonna be doing any practical coding here, but after this video, you're gonna understand single applications a lot better. So that way, when you do learn how to code this stuff, it makes sense why you're doing it. So you gotta start at the beginning to understand the why. In the beginning, there was JavaScript, there was CSS, and there was HTML rendered in your browser, okay? And basically websites were static things that were basically programmed. Basically your browser would go make a request to a server somewhere and it would return it HTML files that would refer to a CSS and JavaScript file and make a website. It was all front end. You didn't have much data manipulation going on. You weren't necessarily saving much in the way of user information. It wasn't until later that you really started having more server-side work done. Probably in the beginning more with like languages like Perl and PHP. Nowadays with pretty much every programming language you can think of, which has some sort of server-side framework or tool or whatnot. So that was the back end. Okay, so in the back end, you now could have a database and store user data, store information for stuff that's going on your website. You could basically also serve that information to people, not just people who use your website, but people who want to use it on their website through APIs. Or you could also, instead of having a static HTML file that gets sent to the user, you could dynamically generate the HTML with server-side rendering, which you'd be using some sort of like template engine like EJS or Pug or Nunjux or Handlebars or Jinja for Python. And what that would do is would just take your template with the information on your back end, smush it together, and create a final HTML file then that gets sent to the browser. Now this is all really cool. It opens up all sorts of new functionality for the user, but with one big catch. When your user sends a GET request to your server, it has to wait for all that stuff to happen before any HTML gets sent back that they can see rendered on their screen. So if you're talking about really complex things going on, so if you've been on a lot of websites, especially like more so years ago, what would happen is that you might wait a while before anything shows up on the screen. Why? Because there's all this back-end code that's finishing its work first, grabbing the resources from everywhere it needs to grab resources for, smushing it together into the template, and then sending the result back to your browser, okay? And the thing is that, you might be using stuff straight from your server, which it grabs pretty quickly, but it might be also grabbing information from external APIs, which may be slower, or from a database where there's several requests coming in, which may slow things down, and it has to wait till all of it comes in before it can mush it with the template. That is okay, depending on the scope and the size of your application, but as it gets bigger, you start really kind of noticing this sort of slowdown in the end result. So then someone said, well, how about this? We'll use the back end to just get the data, but we'll do all the rendering on the browser level. Okay, we'll do it back in the front end. So that way, as we get information, the parts that we can render. So that way people can use certain parts of our website. So now when you use like Facebook, you might notice that even if your like news feed hasn't rendered yet, okay, you might be able to still chat in the chat box or see other parts of the Facebook interface because each of them are sort of loading individually. This is what happens when you have a single page application. So the idea is that instead of a bunch of HTML files with different CSS files and JavaScript files, you generally have one HTML file that calls one thing that triggers a whole array of JavaScript. So literally you have one page and then really your whole website and all of its subsequent inner pages is really embedded within the JavaScript, which then will pull all the information and render as the information comes in. Okay. There are several frameworks that do this sort of single page application. So basically when you're doing this, it's in your front end JavaScript, you're defining the page, how it looks. You're actually even defining your routes. So instead of defining all your routes in your back end, saying, hey, if someone goes to this URL, take them here, instead of taking them to a particular page or to a particular template, what you're going to do is you're going to define routes in your single page application, which then routes them to different parts of that JavaScript or all your files. Okay, now the first really big one was Angular, which was created by Google. Okay, and Angular was awesome. It made life a lot easier when it came to creating single page applications. And there were other sort of competitors at the time, Ember.js, Backbone, which are all still around, but not quite as big as Angular. And Angular was basically the game in town for a long time until Facebook came out with React. Now, React added a couple new things to the game, basically, which all added to speed, particularly what's called a shadow DOM. So what it did is that you have your document object model that is in your browser. So essentially what happens is that when your browser reads an HTML file, it creates sort of a live copy of what the HTML file is, really just a blueprint for the document. It reads the HTML file and then actually creates the live document. So when you're playing with the DOM, the document object model, you're playing with this live object that actually exists in real time in your browser that it created based on the HTML that was given to it. What React did is it created a shadow DOM in the sense that it created another object, okay? And basically what it does is that it's constantly, based on your code, making changes to that shadow DOM, and whenever that shadow DOM changes, it'll pick up on the individual differences and only make those changes to the actual DOM. So instead of re-rendering the whole website every time there's a page, it only re-renders the specific piece of the website that needs to be re-rendered, making things a lot faster, because people aren't reloading their whole page every single time. Okay, making for a better user experience. React introduced JSX, which was kind of a way of basically doing HTML in your JavaScript. They also introduced, and then this became much more component driven. Okay, and this has pretty much become the norm, where basically what you do is you just create a bunch of individual pieces of your website as components, and you reuse them as you need to. So basically you might define a modal, you might define a card, and make it one sort of component that you just reuse over and over again every time you need it on your website, instead of redoing the CSS every time. Basically creating a little encapsulated piece of code that you can just plop in there, almost like HTML. You actually create like HTML tags for it. And then React picked up like very quickly because of these elements that made it really sort of innovative and faster. And everyone's like, oh, okay, well, let's use this over Angular. So then Angular went back to the drawing board and basically updated theirs to take advantage of a lot of these innovations and incorporated a lot of them, plus their own innovations, in a new version, which was originally Angular 2, and now it's like Angular 9. But anything Angular 2 or above is the new version of Angular, which was like a complete rewrite, completely different thing. So what happened is that everyone who upgraded overnight, they're like, oh, it's just another version of Angular, let's upgrade. All their websites broke because it was a completely different thing. So the old version of Angular, which a lot of people still keep because their old websites are based on it and that's what they're used to using, is called Angularjs. The modern version of Angular, which is used by a lot of newer companies and in newer projects, is referred to whatever version it has. But instead of saying Angularjs, you'll say like Angular 7 or Angular 8 or Angular 9. It started with 2. So anything below 2 would be Angularjs. But what happened is that when Angular incorporated those changes, that's when it kind of lost the number one spot, because everyone was so upset over this sort of website breaking change. People are like, fine, I'm just going to go to React. And then React went from being number 2 to number 1. But then I think it's an ex-Google engineer created their own framework for single page applications named Vue. And Vue has now become a very strong third. And Vue is very interesting in the sense that, Angular has the backing of Google. React has the backing of Facebook. Vue is really like a single developer who's developing that, now a team, but it's really grown organically because developers like it, which supposedly incorporates a lot of the best ideas from Angular and React, plus some new things, and supposedly is really kind of easy to learn and use. So that's sort of the single page application world. The thing about these frameworks is that you're building components, you're building pieces of your website that you can reuse. But when you build components in React, you have to use them in sort of a React environment. When you build Angular components, you have to build them in an Angular environment. So now things are sort of beginning in the early stages of an even newer change called web components. So the idea is, how about instead of having a framework specific web component, piece of your website, little chunk of code. How about we just make them the ones that can work in any environment? So now you have what are called web component compilers. Okay, and there's really two in this space. Stencil.js, which is made by the people who made what's called Ionic. So you might know them from like the Ionic font library or Ionic components, which help you originally helped you make mobile apps with Angular, but now can be used for all the frameworks. Then there's also Svelte. Svelte is another web component compiler, and basically their promise is that you're able to create components that can work anywhere. So you don't, if you don't want to use React or Angular, you just want to create a modal that you can use in all your projects, you can do that. Or you can create the whole single page application right out of Svelte or Stencil and then compile it to web standard code, which means as web standards change, you don't need to redo your code, you would just recompile it. This has not yet become the norm, as these are very, very new. Right now, if you're looking in the job market, the jobs are for Angular, React, and Vue, the three big. There are other single page application frameworks, such as I mentioned before, Ember, Backbone, and a few others, but the big kahunas are Angular, React, and Vue. Okay, so what does this mean for the backend? Does it mean we don't use Express anymore? Well, what happens nowadays is you'll use Express, you'll use your backend, whatever backend, it could be Python, Django, or whatever, Ruby on Rails. You use your backend server to serve up the information through API endpoints. And then in your Angular, React, or Vue app, you'll pull that information as if you were pulling from an external API using an AJAX call, whether it's through the native JavaScript fetch API, and making GET requests or any kind of requests using the jQuery library or Axios library, which are sort of the two most popular ones in that space. You would call that information into the browser, and then again, your front end single page application done in React, Vue, or Angular will then render that information onto the screen. Okay, so that's the basic idea. A couple other terms to be familiar with is that you'll hear throughout all these different objects. There are terms that you'll see. In Angular, there's a term called observables. Observables are essentially the same thing it's kind of like their version of making a promise in JavaScript. So basically doing asynchronous things. There is state. State was originally introduced by React, but it's now become standard among all the single page applications. State are just sort of your internal variables, internal to your component, that may change. Generally, when your framework notices that these state variables have changed, it re-renders that component on the screen. Again, not the whole website, just that component. And this allows you to sort of control how much of your website is re-rendering at any point, but have a website that's constantly live with the changes as needed. There's properties. Okay, so kind of like how you have HTML properties, you'll be able to define variables within your components that can be treated like HTML properties, where you define them when you put the tag in your HTML, and you're able to pass down information to your JavaScript components. Neat. And then the shadow DOM, as we mentioned earlier, which is just sort of like a extra copy of the DOM that monitors for changes and then changes the real DOM once it notices that there's differences between the two. And only changes the parts that are different instead of the whole DOM, which creates the extra speed because you're not doing a full re-rendering, you're only doing a partial re-rendering. I know that's a lot of information. Again, this is just supposed to help give you a high-level understanding of what's going on as you learn how a single-page application framework like React, Vue, or Angular work. But hopefully this makes life a lot easier, helps paint the picture, paint the situation. My name is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com. Make sure to head over to alexmercedcoder.com and sign up for my web developer networking group. It's a Slack channel where you can meet other web developers, show your portfolio, do all sorts of cool stuff. It's a great way to meet other people for just to have, again, a closer community, but also find opportunities and to get good advice. I'll talk to you guys later. Have a great day and enjoy.